In the early 1930s, long before the United States was at war with Japan, military planners quietly contemplated a bomber that could strike any target in the Pacific from American soil. The limitations of existing aircraft were glaring. The B-29 Flying Fortress, then the pride of the Army Air Corps, could reach only parts of Europe and carry a modest bomb load. But to project power across the vast Pacific, planners envisioned a plane that was faster, higher flying, and far more capable. A bomber that could reach Japan from bases in China or India with a payload sufficient to cripple industrial targets. This vision would eventually take form as the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the largest and most complex aircraft of its era. Lockheed and Boeing engineers confronted nearly every conceivable technical challenge. The B-29 was unlike any aircraft ever attempted. Pressurized crew compartments allowed missions at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, theoretically beyond the range of most Japanese fighters in anti-aircraft fire. Remote-controlled powered gun turrets, linked to centralized analog sights, would permit defensive fire without exposing gunners to freezing high-altitude winds. And 4 Wright R-3350 radial engines promised the thrust to lift a fully loaded bomber over 60,000 pounds into the sky. Each innovation, however, brought unforeseen difficulties. Engines overheated, pressurization systems leaked, and the first prototypes were plagued with vibrations that shook instruments and crew alike. During the first test flights in 1942, pilots often reported a mix of awe and terror. Major Paul W. Tibbets, who would later command the 509th Composite Group, described feeling as though he were riding a mechanical leviathan, marveling at its power while acutely aware that one misstep could turn the aircraft into a falling coffin. Maintenance crews labored tirelessly, often in sweltering conditions, to keep the R-3350s from exploding mid-flight. Each day, the B-29 program balanced on a knife's edge between unprecedented technological achievement and catastrophic failure. By mid-1943, after months of testing and redesigns, the Superfortress began to emerge from the shadows of skepticism. High-altitude trials demonstrated that, when operating within design parameters, the B-29 could indeed cruise at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet with a bomb load that dwarfed the B-17. For the first time, U.S. planners could conceive of a sustained bombing campaign against Japan itself without relying solely on aircraft carriers or the long-range Pacific Fleet. The implications were profound. American industry could strike at the heart of the Japanese war machine, forcing a response from an enemy unprepared for aerial attacks from such heights. Even as engineers celebrated breakthroughs, the human element was ever present. Crews learned to navigate the stratosphere with primitive radar and dead reckoning techniques. They practiced emergency procedures for oxygen failures, decompression, and engine fire, knowing that one error could be fatal. In letters home, pilots wrote of the surreal experience of looking down on the clouds from higher than any previous operational aircraft had flown, the ground below appearing distant and unreal, while the engine's constant roar reminded them that at 30,000 feet there was little margin for error. While engineers wrestled with the B-29's mechanical complexities, the Army Air Forces faced an equally daunting task, preparing crews to operate a bomber unlike any they had flown before. Unlike the familiar B-17 or B-24, the Superfortress was a flying city. It required a 9- or 10-man crew, each member performing highly specialized tasks under conditions that pushed both human endurance and technical skill to their limits. The formation of the 21st Bomber Command in early 1943 marked the beginning of a rigorous, unprecedented training program. Airmen were drawn from across the United States, often seasoned B-17 or B-24 veterans, but even their experience offered little preparation for the Superfortress. Pilots faced engines that burned hotter than any they had seen, while navigators grappled with charts and instruments that required precise calculations at extreme altitudes. Bombardiers trained with advanced Norden bomb sights, learning to compensate for wind drift and temperature variations at 30,000 feet, calculations that could determine the success or failure of a mission. Training took place at multiple sites across the continental United States, from Kansas and New Mexico to the deserts of California. Crews practiced formation flying in groups of 3 or 4 B-29s, coordinating maneuvers with a precision that could rival a ballet. Simulated missions tested endurance, sometimes lasting 12 to 14 hours, often in temperatures below freezing at high altitude. Gunners rehearsed with the aircraft's remote-controlled turrets, learning to track fast-moving targets through analog sights while seated in pressurized compartments isolated from the rest of the crew. Life on the training bases was a mix of monotony, danger, and camaraderie. Pilots described the constant tension of knowing that a single engine failure could send a fully loaded bomber crashing into the prairie. Mechanics worked long shifts, often under the sun or in bitter cold, repairing engines prone to overheating and explosion. But in letters home, crews spoke more of friendships and shared jokes than of fear. They learned to rely on each other implicitly. In the stratosphere, a crew that could not function as a single unit was doomed. Instructors emphasized not just technical mastery, but psychological preparedness. Flying a B-29 on a combat mission meant facing enemy fighters and flak at altitudes where oxygen was thin and the body's ability to react was diminished. Pilots and crew underwent hypoxia drills, decompression simulations, and emergency oxygen training. They learned to remain calm when instruments froze, when engine gauges spiked, or when a sudden storm buffeted the massive fuselage. Tales of early crashes during training circulated among airmen, reminders of the fine line between skill and disaster. Temperatures, oxygen deprivation, and mechanical unreliability. Even when engagements occurred, the B-29's speed and high-altitude capability frequently allowed it to escape unscathed. Searchlights and early warning networks attempted to detect incoming raids, but their effectiveness was limited by weather, night operations, and the unprecedented flight profiles of the bombers. Japanese radar technology, still in its infancy compared to Allied systems, struggled to provide timely alerts. For many defenders, the B-29 seemed untouchable, an aircraft capable of delivering devastation from above with little fear of reprisal. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers reflected frustration and disbelief, often describing the Superfortress as a ghost in the sky whose attacks defied conventional tactics. Meanwhile, the civilian population faced escalating terror and disruption. Firebombing raids, particularly on urban centers like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, created widespread chaos. Families fled homes, sought shelter in basements or open fields, and often traveled long distances to escape the advancing flames. Hospitals, schools, and marketplaces were destroyed alongside factories, compounding the humanitarian crisis. Memoirs and post-war interviews describe nights illuminated by the glow of distant fires, the thunder of explosions shaking homes, and the constant uncertainty of whether one's neighborhood would survive the next raid. Evacuation measures were hastily implemented, but resources were limited. Public air raid drills and blackouts were widespread, yet they offered only partial protection. Civilians endured food shortages, disruption of transportation, and a pervasive sense of helplessness. For many, the raids represented not just military action, but a profound psychological shock. An enemy that had once seemed distant and abstract could now strike deep into the heart of Japan with impunity. The human cost was enormous, but the raids also forced ingenuity. Communities improvised shelters, fire breaks, and evacuation routes. Local militias assisted in firefighting despite inadequate equipment. School children were conscripted to help clear rubble or deliver supplies, reflecting the total mobilization of society in response to the threat. Japanese authorities issued warnings, enforced curfews, and attempted to coordinate defense efforts, but the scale and speed of the B-29 campaign consistently outpaced preparation. For American air crews, these missions underscored the effectiveness of their training and technology. Each sortie demonstrated that the Superfortress could achieve strategic objectives even under challenging conditions, delivering not only destruction but a psychological message. Japan's homeland was no longer beyond reach. Yet the human dimension, both of Japanese suffering and of the ethical weight carried by the crews, remained deeply felt. Many airmen later reflected on the contrast between precision objectives and often indiscriminate destruction of firebombing, acknowledging the war's grim realities while remaining committed to the mission. By the summer of 1945, it was clear that Japanese countermeasures, while brave and resourceful, were insufficient to halt the B-29 campaign. Civilians had endured the brunt of the attacks, their resilience tested under unimaginable strain. The Superfortress had become a tool not just of destruction, but of psychological dominance, reshaping the landscape of the Pacific War and leaving an indelible mark on both the Japanese homeland and the collective memory of those who lived through it. Post-war evaluations revealed the scale of the superfortress's effect. Factories producing aircraft, ships, and munitions were crippled. Transportation networks were disrupted, and key urban centers were reduced to rubble. Beyond physical destruction, the psychological impact on the Japanese military and civilian population was profound. Leaders had to confront the stark reality that their homeland could be reached and devastated by a force operating thousands of miles from the nearest base. Civilians, who long had relied on geographic isolation and traditional air defenses, faced a new and terrifying form of warfare. For the air crews, the campaign was both a triumph and a trial. Letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs convey the intensity of each mission. The fear of mechanical failure, the stress of navigation across vast distances, and the responsibility of dropping bombs on populated areas. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners became intimately familiar with the limits of human endurance, yet they performed with precision and discipline under circumstances that tested the boundaries of aviation capability. Their experiences would become foundational lessons for post-war strategic air operations. Technologically, the B-29 set new standards for aviation. Its pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, long-range engines, and high-altitude performance influenced the design of subsequent strategic bombers, from the B-50 to the modern jet-powered bombers of the Cold War. The campaign also demonstrated the necessity of robust logistics, careful maintenance, and continuous adaptation of tactics in large-scale air operations, lessons studied by military planners worldwide for decades after the war. Japanese post-war reflections underscore the depth of the campaign's impact. Interviews with surviving military officers and civilians reveal a mixture of awe, fear, and somber recognition. Many noted that the raids accelerated the war's end by undermining industrial production and eroding morale, while others recounted the human suffering that accompanied the destruction. In both narratives, the B-29 emerged as a symbol of technological superiority and a turning point in the conduct of modern warfare. Ultimately, the B-29 campaign over Japan was more than a series of raids. It represented a paradigm shift. It proved that air power could operate over vast distances with strategic effect, reshaping military planning and altering the global balance of force projection. The Superfortress became a benchmark of innovation, endurance, and adaptability, demonstrating the integration of technology, human skill, and industrial might on a scale never before seen. As the war drew to a close with Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Superfortress had secured its place in history. It left a legacy not only in destroyed cities and disrupted industries, but in the evolution of strategic thinking, the training of air crews, and the demonstration of American technological and operational ingenuity. The B-29 had stunned Japan from 30,000 feet, but it had also set a precedent for the future of warfare, proving that innovation, courage, and determination could overcome distance, altitude, and adversity. Its story remains a powerful reminder of both the capabilities and the consequences of strategic bombing, a final chapter in the relentless air campaign that helped end the deadliest conflict in human history.
Recognition of the enormous impact of their actions, even as they fulfilled the strategic objectives assigned to them. For Japanese military planners, the firebombing campaign forced a reevaluation of air defense doctrine. Anti-aircraft guns and early warning systems were overwhelmed, and there were no adequate countermeasures against formations of B-29s capable of operating at high or medium altitudes with impunity. Civilians faced evacuation orders, rationing, and the constant fear of the next raid. The psychological shock was profound. Entire communities lived under a constant shadow of terror, unsure when the next wave of aircraft would strike. The escalation of raids marked a decisive shift in the air war over Japan. The B-29 was no longer merely a symbol of technological prowess, it had become a weapon of unparalleled strategic significance. Its ability to deliver destruction with accuracy, scale, and psychological effect demonstrated that Japan's geography and traditional defenses could no longer shield the homeland. By the end of 1944, the stage was set for a relentless campaign that would test both the endurance of American air crews and the resilience of Japanese society, bringing the conflict closer to its ultimate conclusion. By early 1945, the B-29 campaign over Japan had entered a period of intense operational activity, but each mission reminded crews and commanders alike that the Superfortress, for all its revolutionary design, was far from invulnerable. The sheer complexity of the aircraft imposed constant demands on maintenance crews, pilots, and gunners. Even routine flights were fraught with risk, and the combination of mechanical strain, weather hazards, and Japanese countermeasures made each sortie a careful balance between innovation and endurance. Mechanical failures were the most persistent obstacle. The Wright R-3350 engines, despite numerous modifications, remained prone to overheating, particularly during takeoff and climbs to high altitudes. Pilots learned to feather propellers on failing engines and to adjust airspeed to manage temperatures, often improvising in mid-flight to prevent catastrophic fire. Pressurization systems critical for operations at 30,000 feet sometimes malfunctioned, causing hypoxia or freezing conditions in the crew compartments. Bombardiers and navigators contended with intermittent instrument failures and fluctuating oxygen levels that could impair judgment. For engineers and mechanics on the ground, every sortie was a race against time to repair engines, replace failing components, and prepare aircraft for the next mission. Tactically, crews faced the persistent challenge of Japan's adaptation to the B-29 threat. While the Japanese Air Force lacked sufficient numbers of high-altitude interceptors, they experimented with specialized fighters and radar tracking to counter the raids. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned and modified to target the Superfortress at altitudes previously considered safe. Searchlights, flak barrages, and kamikaze-style interception tactics added additional layers of danger for air crews, particularly during twilight and night operations. Even with these limited countermeasures, the B-29's combination of speed, altitude, and payload ensured a significant operational advantage, but never absolute safety. Weather, too, was an unpredictable adversary. Jet streams frequently disrupted bombing accuracy, particularly in the winter months. Crews learned to adjust release calculations dynamically, compensating for high-altitude winds that could scatter bombs miles off target. Thunderstorms posed both electrical hazards and violent turbulence, testing pilot skill and nerves. Navigators and bombardiers worked under intense pressure to deliver bombs precisely, knowing that even small errors could leave critical factories untouched or endanger civilians unintentionally. By mid-1945, the technological and tactical challenges of the B-29 campaign had forged an exceptionally skilled cadre of airmen. Japanese defenses had adapted as best they could, but they were consistently outmatched by a combination of altitude, speed, and crew expertise. Each mission tested the limits of both man and machine, creating a delicate interplay between innovation, strategy, and endurance. The B-29 had become not just a bomber, but a symbol of American industrial and operational ingenuity, a weapon capable of striking deep into Japan while pushing the boundaries of aviation technology to their extreme limits. By mid-1945, the psychological and physical effects of the B-29 raids were evident across Japan. Cities that had once seemed secure from aerial attack now faced an invisible, relentless threat from the stratosphere. Japanese military planners scrambled to adapt, implementing new countermeasures even as civilians endured mounting fear and disruption. The Superfortress had changed the rules of engagement, and Japan's defenses, while resourceful, were stretched to the breaking point. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy attempted a combination of technological innovation and tactical adaptation. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned to cover key industrial cities, while heavier artillery and radar systems were deployed to track high-flying B-29 formations. Specialized fighter units such as the Nakajima K-44 Tojo and Kawasaki K-61 Hien were scrambled to intercept the bombers at altitudes previously considered beyond reach. Pilots faced grueling climbs in aircraft not optimized for such heights, often confronting freeze. Bombs and fuel roared into the sky, their pressurized cabins allowing crews to operate in relative comfort despite the thin, frigid air at high altitude. Bombardiers meticulously adjusted their Norden bomb sights, compensating for wind drift, altitude, and the early morning haze that obscured the target. Pilots held formation with precision, aware that dispersal could reduce defensive firepower and increase vulnerability. From the perspective of the Japanese defenders, the raid was both bewildering and alarming. Anti-aircraft batteries were largely calibrated for lower-flying aircraft, and fighters capable of reaching 30,000 feet were scarce and often underpowered. Observers on the ground reported shadows moving across the clouds before the distant thud of explosions echoed through the valleys below. Civilian populations were stunned by the sudden appearance of destruction from a height they had believed to be safe. Many could only watch in disbelief as their industrial centers, untouched for years, were suddenly vulnerable to an invisible and unstoppable enemy. The first missions were not without challenge. Mechanical issues plagued the aircraft even in flight. Wright R-3350 engines frequently overheated, forcing crews to adjust power and feather propellers to prevent catastrophic failure. Turret malfunctions and pressurization problems tested the ingenuity and nerve of gunners and flight engineers alike. Yet, despite these difficulties, the raids demonstrated the Superfortress's unparalleled capabilities. It could fly farther, higher, and with a greater payload than any aircraft the Japanese had previously encountered. The psychological impact of the raids was immediate. Japanese military planners scrambled to understand this new threat. Reports of bombers operating at unprecedented altitudes caused confusion and frustration. Radar and visual spotting were unreliable at such heights, and the slow response of interceptors revealed a critical vulnerability in Japan's air defense network. For civilians, the shock was compounded by the sheer scale of the explosions. Even when casualties were relatively limited compared to later raids, the knowledge that the homeland was now within reach of enemy bombers spread fear and uncertainty. For the American crews, the missions were a mix of exhilaration and tension. Pilots recalled the surreal experience of peering down through clouds at distant cities, seeing smoke and fire marking the impact of their bombs. Bombardiers measured the accuracy of their drops with the intense scrutiny of men who knew each strike could influence the war's outcome. Radio silence and operational secrecy heightened the tension, as crews could neither confirm success nor communicate emergencies without risking exposure of the new bomber's capabilities. By the end of 1944, multiple raids had demonstrated the B-29's potential. The combination of high altitude, heavy bomb load, and long range made the Superfortress a weapon unlike any Japan had ever encountered. Each sortie delivered not only physical damage, but a profound psychological message. The United States could reach the Japanese heartland from bases thousands of miles away. Commanders on both sides understood that the rules of the Pacific Air War had irrevocably changed. These first raids set the stage for a new era of strategic bombing, one that would escalate in scale, intensity, and devastation over the following months. Japanese cities, once shielded by geography and altitude, were now vulnerable to the unprecedented reach of the B-29, and both the military and civilian population would soon come to understand the full implications of American air power from 30,000 feet. By late 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had evolved. The early high-altitude raids over Japan demonstrated the B-29's capability, but results were mixed. Precision bombing at 30,000 feet was often hindered by jet stream winds, unpredictable weather, and smoke from previous strikes obscuring targets. Planners in the 21st Bomber Command began considering alternatives, including incendiary raids designed to exploit Japan's largely wooden urban construction. The aim was not only to destroy industrial capacity, but to shatter morale, demonstrating to both civilians and military leaders that no city was safe from American air power. The first large-scale firebombing missions began in November 1944. Tokyo, with its dense clusters of wooden homes and industrial facilities, became the primary target. Crews trained specifically for low-level night raids, adapting techniques to maximize the effectiveness of incendiary bombs. Bombardiers calculated precise drop patterns to create conflagrations that would leap from building to building, while pilots navigated treacherous wind currents that could scatter payloads. The psychological burden was immense. For many airmen, the destruction inflicted on civilian neighborhoods, even with strategic intent, weighed heavily. Letters and diaries from the crews reveal a mix of professional detachment and personal unease. Japanese civilians and military authorities were caught off guard. Traditional anti-aircraft defenses proved largely ineffective against B-29s at altitude, and the incendiary attacks at lower altitudes introduced a new, terrifying dimension. Residents watched entire neighborhoods engulfed in flames, streets turned into rivers of fire. Evacuation efforts were chaotic and often insufficient. Hospitals, schools, and marketplaces, along with factories, were consumed. Eyewitness accounts later described a sea of fires stretching across city districts, with panic spreading as families fled into open fields, rivers, or any available shelter. From the U.S. perspective, the firebombing raids represented both an operational and technological achievement. Crews had learned to coordinate hundreds of bombs with remarkable precision, even in the dark, at low altitude, and under enemy fire. Formation flying became a critical skill. Planes flew in tight groups to concentrate incendiaries and maintain defensive coverage. Yet challenges remained. Engines overheated, navigation errors occurred, and Japanese fighters, though limited, attempted harassing attacks, particularly during dusk and dawn. Every mission demanded courage, discipline, and ingenuity.
Navigators and bombardiers faced perhaps the greatest challenge. Unlike Europe, where targets could be approached from multiple angles and over shorter distances, missions to Japan required transcontinental flights over mountains, jungles, and the vast Pacific. Dead reckoning techniques, celestial navigation, and the early use of radar bombing became essential tools. Even a minor miscalculation could leave a crew hundreds of miles off course, forcing them to bail out or attempt a perilous landing in hostile territory. By mid-1944, after months of relentless training, the air crews were ready for deployment. Confidence replaced apprehension, forged in the crucible of endless drills, mechanical failures, and simulated missions. They were prepared not just to fly the B-29, but to exploit its revolutionary capabilities. The ability to strike at altitudes previously considered safe from interception, to deliver unprecedented bomb loads, and to execute missions over terrain and distances that would have been impossible only a few years prior. The B-29 was more than a machine, and the air crews were more than pilots or gunners. Together, they represented the culmination of human ingenuity and determination. Their training was grueling, but it instilled the precision, courage, and endurance that would soon astonish Japanese defenders who had yet to comprehend that the skies above their cities were about to host a new kind of threat, one from 30,000 feet, nearly untouchable and devastatingly effective. By the summer of 1944, the B-29 Superfortresses were finally ready for combat, but a new challenge loomed, delivering them to striking distance of Japan. Unlike in Europe, where American bombers could operate from England or Italy, the vast distances of the Pacific theater presented an unprecedented logistical puzzle.
strategic planners decided on a bold two-part approach: station the bombers in India and forward bases in China, then fly missions over Japanese-held territory. It was a plan fraught with difficulty, danger, and secrecy. Transporting B-29s to these remote bases required flying over the Himalayas, a region the Allies referred to simply as the Hump. Pilots faced brutal weather conditions, violent turbulence, sudden icing, and thin air that tested both engine and crew limits. The R-3350 engines, already notorious for overheating, were particularly susceptible to failure in these high-altitude, high-stress flights. Crews quickly learned that even routine ferry missions demanded absolute precision. A single navigation error could mean crashing into jagged Himalayan peaks or disappearing into the monsoon clouds. The logistical strain extended beyond flying. Forward bases in China had minimal infrastructure. Runways were often little more than leveled dirt, maintenance facilities were rudimentary, and spare parts were scarce. Each B-29 required hundreds of tons of fuel, bombs, and spare engines, all of which had to be flown in over treacherous routes. Airmen joked darkly about the roundabout supply chain, knowing that the survival of every mission depended on an intricate chain of deliveries across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. Japanese forces were aware of Allied activity in the region, but had limited capacity to disrupt these operations. Nevertheless, reconnaissance reports and intercepted communications kept planners on edge. Each flight could be intercepted by Japanese fighters over Burma or eastern China, and forward bases were vulnerable to sudden attacks. Security protocols were strict. Crews were briefed to maintain complete radio silence, and movements were cloaked in secrecy to prevent leaks that could compromise the first strategic bombing campaign against Japan itself. Air crews quickly adapted to the rigors of the mission. Pilots described the surreal sensation of taking off from improvised Chinese airfields, climbing through dense layers of clouds, and eventually reaching cruising altitudes above 30,000 feet. Bombardiers adjusted to the thin air and cold, relying on their advanced Norden bomb sights to plot precise courses over unfamiliar terrain. Mechanics performed mid-mission troubleshooting in cramped pressurized compartments, monitoring engine temperatures and adjusting controls to prevent catastrophic failure. The combination of mechanical skill, navigational expertise, and mental endurance became as important as courage in combat. Despite the hardships, the first operational raids from India and China proved the strategy's potential. B-29 crews marveled at the ability to traverse such distances with a payload exceeding 5 tons, striking targets in Japan that were previously thought untouchable. For Japanese commanders, the first reports of these flights were alarming. Aircraft capable of reaching Japanese cities from bases hundreds of miles away without warning challenged every assumption about air defense. Civilians were equally stunned when the distant thunder of bombs reached their ears, high-altitude detonations that seemed impossible to counter. The secret nature of the route also became a source of psychological pressure. Crews knew that failure over the Himalayas could mean total isolation with little hope of rescue. Yet the same isolation fostered camaraderie and trust among the men. Pilots, navigators, and gunners relied on each other with absolute faith, understanding that survival depended on every link of the chain, from takeoff in India, across the hump, to the target over Japan and back. By late 1944, the operation had proven both feasible and terrifying. The B-29s, once confined to experimental flights and training bases, were now operational weapons, ready to deliver unprecedented destruction. Japanese defenses had yet to comprehend the full extent of the threat. High above the clouds, the superfortresses silently awaited, and the stage was set for the raids that would leave Japan stunned by the sheer audacity and scale of American strategic bombing. The summer of 1944 marked a turning point in the air war over the Pacific. After months of grueling training, treacherous ferry flights over the Himalayas, and painstaking preparations at forward bases in China, the first B-29 Superfortresses were ready to strike the Japanese homeland.
For U.S. planners, these missions represented both a technical triumph and a strategic gamble. Could aircraft flying from 30,000 feet, seemingly untouchable, inflict meaningful damage on an enemy that had never experienced such a threat?